Hello. As I said in part one, there seems to be three distinct viewpoints and uh, positions here. The existence of private mercenary companies is either, in the case of Blackwater, in the case of Iraq, as a direct threat to the state's power, or, in the second case, that Blackwater was used by the US government to do a job which it was unpopular for the US military to do. As I said in my previous videos, over 50% of the US forces in Iraq were contractors, private military companies. Blackwater has since changed its name to Z as a public relations thing. So, if you privatise the SAS into, by de facto, letting the members of the SAS become part of these private military companies, leads on to the third point, which is that although it might be convenient for the state to use them in operations under the auspices of them being private military companies to do jobs, say in Libya, which they've said legally they won't be able to put boots on the ground, but they could get the rebels in Libya could put their own forces on the ground as private military companies. There are people who have special forces experience either from Europeans, British or Americans or Russians or Africans or other or Middle Easterners in some way, which leads on to the third viewpoint, that mercenaries can be the last resort for people who are governments in waiting rather than governments, such as the Boers of South Africa. Now, I said in my video that on South Africa and Blackwater that the Boers could ask Blackwater to intervene in South Africa because no other government will recognise the Boers as an independent people. Similar cases can be made for Libya, Syria, where there's now a massive crackdown on the democracy movement, which you will be able to, which I will talk more about in my video, Decimating Democracy in Damascus. Well, in my view, the existence of private military companies in the West does give flexibility to governments. It does give the ability for governments in waiting, such as the rebels and such of Libya, in Benghazi and in the independent Boer Republic, which is in waiting to become something that is a reality. If the Boers choose to want it, the Boers choose to have a European Union style model for Southern Africa, and if they could get the US and the EU to back it. But private military companies, in my view, are a threat to the state's power. If we are to have armed forces, then they must be an armed forces which is a public service. It's a uniformed armed public service. That is why we pay taxes. That is why we pay taxes, because they're there to protect us from people who have arms in private hands. That is terrorist organisations, feudalistic crime families, gangsters and the like, that their ilk, basically. Otherwise, why else do we pay taxes? The armed forces should thus get the best amount of taxes that the government can provide it. At present, in Britain, we spend 0.7% on our of our GDP on defence, which is pitiful considering that we're in three major wars. That is Iraq, Afghanistan, where we're fighting the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and the war against Al Qaeda itself. And there may be other wars that are going on that we're not aware of against drugs or other feudalistic crime families in the Middle East or elsewhere. This all leads to the need for a much larger special forces community in Britain. The SAS has showed in World War II that it could become a large special forces community without losing its cutting edge, without losing its elite status. The Royal Marines also were much larger in World War II than they are at present. I mean, they had to storm the D-Day beaches, for crying out loud, as well as special forces missions. But how should we deploy the SAS or others? Well, I'm no expert. I'm not going to play armchair general. But I would say that the forces, unlike in the American Constitution, which say that military forces can't be deployed domestically, in Britain we don't have that problem of legitimacy for the armed forces. The armed forces have got legitimacy under the law to conduct military operations in the domestic sphere, right? Because Al Qaeda doesn't respect borders. It's an international private army of the Bin Laden crime family and the Saudi royal family. And the only way we're going to eventually beat these people, as I've said so many times on my videos, is to take the war to Saudi Arabia through a revolution, through the use of special forces on the ground, through airstrikes, and then through a massive European and American coordinated British-led invasion of Saudi Arabia. Only then will we be able to solve the problems of the link between oil companies such as Exxon, Halliburton, and whoever, other bad guys, people like that, and the Saudi and Bin Laden crime families who control the oil spigot and the Federal Reserve System, all of which the Bin Ladens were chiefly responsible for and the Saudis were chiefly responsible for, which led to 9/11, which unleashed this global mega war on the world, which had been going on previously for nearly 40 years, which wasn't shown on our TV screens because it was done in clandestine ways until the Kenyan bombing, the attack on the USS Cole, and then 9/11. What we will see in the future is probably Al Qaeda go back to its more clandestine methods of assassination through knives, boxing, guns, poison, and all the rest of it that they did on Richard Pearl, the New York journalist, New York Times journalist. But this will require a much more secretive war, a much more sophisticated war, and thus more sophisticated, more subtle, and more professional soldiers, which means intelligence work, which means the SAS has hit teams for intelligence organisations in the West. And we will be operating in a much more delicate situation because the countries which Al Qaeda will be in the future may well be democracies. They may well be our allies, but they may still harbour resentments from their past occupations or other such things, such as Iraq. So may have anti-Western democracies, but I think the fact that they are democracies, even if they may be anti-Western in the future, will be a good thing, because democracies usually join together and form alliances, and eventually I believe the Arabic and Islamic world will be part of the Western world, and they will even adopt democracy and secularism. I think that's what's happening right now, and that leads me on to my next video, Decimating Democracy in Damascus, Syria. Thank you for listening. Check that video out.